好，各位朋友，大家好，就很欢迎大家来参加 Global Asia Research Center 的这个演讲哈。我是台大社会系吴嘉玲，今天很荣幸的可以介绍我的同事翁哲瑞 Jeffrey Wong。那哲瑞他是加州大学伯克莱校区的社会学博士。好，2020完成博士学位之后，在史丹佛从事那个博士后研究，之后就来台大社会系任教。那今天的演讲是以他博士论文为主题所发展出来的演讲 ，The Transformation of Language and Society in Japan, Korea and Vietnam。那这个论文的部分的研究成果已经发表在很好的期刊《Theory and Society》或《Journal of Asian Studies》，但是 Jeff 也想把它发展成一本书，所以我想他今天的演讲会很希望得到这个大家的讨论。那我们就以热烈掌声来欢迎 Jeff。好，那我们的演讲是50分钟，然后之后就开放Q&A。那演讲会用英文的方式来进行，但是 Jeff 是一个多声带吼，他的中文等会你们就会知道发音比大部分人都还要所谓的标准。好，所以我们可以用任何的语言跟他沟通。好 ，Without further ado, Jeff。
谢谢嘉玲那么flattering 的那个介绍。So today's talk will be delivered in English because no time to transform it into Chinese, and I understand that we have a multilingual audience, and so it's fitting that we have a sort of cosmopolitanism going on in this space, because what I'm going to introduce to you today, sort of historically looking at the greater East Asia region in the late 19th and early 20th century space. So the title, it really began in about 2015, 2016, when I was about a quarter of the way through the dissertation on language reform in China. And the period was, from the 1890s to about the 1930s, when Mandarin was essentially invented by the government and the intellectuals working in the government. And so that was an interesting project to me because, if any of you have ever been to China, you understand the complexity of the language situation there. You learn perfect Mandarin in the classroom, and then you go outside, and then you can't understand anybody. And that actually might be mildly true in Taiwan as well. I've actually attended a talk before at the ICLP here, and everyone had, all of the teachers had this very artificially perfect Mandarin. It was very normative, and it was very Beijing. And the moment you step outside, people sort of let loose, let their hair down, they talk differently. And so the complexity of this language situation is multiplied, many times in China just because of its size and the linguistic diversity that you get there. But if you go to a university space, for example, or if you look at the media, look at or listen to the media, you get something very different. And so in sort of working my way through that project, how do you get from sort of the Tower of Babel kind of situation to much more uniformity? My advisor at the time, who is actually a Japan and Korea specialist named John Lee at the University of California at Berkeley, advised me to do a comparison with the broader region, because all of these processes, right, the transformation of language, were transnational, right? Other countries influenced each other, people traveled from place to place, not just to other countries in Asia, but also to the North America and Europe at the time, especially intellectuals looking to seek more education. And so it really is a regional and a global story. And so where we begin, right, we'll start with a map. Oh dear. Okay. Of the region, right? So this is a little anachronistic because the borders are modern, right? But we're essentially talking about 4 different units, okay? We're talking about China, which was the regional hegemon for more than 2,000 years, right? By far the largest imperial space in this sort of corner of Asia, right? But we're also talking about Japan and Korea which are lumped in with China, usually in Centers for East Asian Studies in the United States for Cold War reasons, right? What's usually left out of this conversation, and which I'm going to lump into this conversation, and which has become a trend in the sort of transnational Asia scholarship, is to include Vietnam, right? Vietnam in the United States is usually included in Southeast Asian studies, right? A completely different region for Cold War reasons, because the United States had interests in the 60s and 70s in Vietnam, right? Because of the war, and the broader region surrounding that, right? And so it's usually treated separately, right? But why am I including it? Well, Vietnam was part of the classical Chinese cosmopolitanism that was the established hegemonic sort of language practices for 2,000 years, all the way until about the middle of the 19th century, right? So when we're talking about cosmopolitanism, we're talking about a very narrow slice of society, right? The people with the time, the money, and other resources to engage in, years, decades of education to learn this essentially dead language, right? Classical Chinese was a lot like Latin. It was a primarily written language. It was not primarily a spoken language. And so the division between written and spoken will progressively break down as I tell this story due to European influences, right? The new European ways of thinking about language that entered into this region. So we have, up until the late 19th century, mid to late 19th century, texts, right, circulating through this region. But what direction do they circulate in? Well, that's a very interesting question, because even though scholars in Japan and Korea and Vietnam were learning, reading, and writing texts in classical Chinese primarily for each other, the direction of circulation really was from China out, right? So China considered itself a very self-sufficient culture. It was very self-satisfied. It had a lot of people, it had a lot of land, it had a lot of history, right? And so people might write something in classical Chinese in Japan, it probably would not travel to China, right? People would write things in classical Chinese in China, and it would make its way out, right? For example, the dissemination of Buddhism, right, about 1,500 years ago, right, was primarily through the medium of Chinese translations of Sanskrit texts, making their way through Korea to Japan, right, and through China to Vietnam. And so it was a very one-sided relationship for a long time. But in the 19th century, this started to reverse, right? This started to change, especially because Japan became a lot stronger very quickly, especially starting in the 1870s. And so for China, you can probably understand for the last 150 years, the Communist Party calls it the century of humiliation. Well, it's a very, very traumatic period, right? Where your sort of loss of status, loss of hegemony becomes very, very painful and very, very acute, right? So, originally, I just wanted to tell the story of these countries, but when you submit a story to a social science journal, you have to put a theoretical framework around it. So I have constructed this, and it works because you get a lot of errors in the literature on nationalism, right? Especially in the famous ones by Anderson and Hobsbawm that started off this current wave of nationalism literature in the 1980s, right? But really, we should go back a decade, because Anderson really leans on this sort of French annales school of history, sort of this sort of macro historical view of things that began with Lucien Febvre and his student Henri Jean Martin in 1976. And the book in English translation is called The Coming of the Book, right? So it's a history of books. And it's about, it goes to the medieval times. It talks about the rise of national vernaculars in Renaissance Europe, and how they began to supplant Latin, and how they fed into nationalism, right? And so Anderson sort of absorbs this narrative into his story about what he calls print capitalism, right? That's the key word from his book, print capitalism, and the spread of these languages, right, from sort of intellectual centers, urban centers, printing presses, right, to the masses as they gradually gained access to basic education, right, literacy. Hobsbawm largely also tells this story. So, it's a story about modernization, right? This sort of nationalism being a modern phenomenon, being a very sort of late 18th century, early 19th century phenomenon, growing up with industrialization, with the increase of print technology and the dissemination of these national languages. And so I call this, you get to slap a label on things, willy-nilly in the social sciences. So I call this the diffusionist model, right? I went through several iterations of things with more syllables, but diffusionist has less. So that's why I call it. But the other reason that I call it diffusion, right, is because they think of it as Parisian French, right, to cite a normative example, a commonly cited example, spreading out to the provinces in France. In Europe, you get a similar amount of linguistic diversity, right? Parisian French is spoken by an elite bunch of people, right? People with the time and the money to go to school and to learn how to talk, right, before recording technology. So not very many people speak French in the 1870s, only about a third of the country, right? It's only at about World War I, where there's a widespread mobilization of soldiers, and after decades of urbanization and migration in France, that you get more and more people speaking standard French. So that's the story, right? What's the story they tell about Asia? Well, it's quite different, right? They think, right, and I think this is just an error of ignorance, that Asia is generally ethnically homogeneous, right? And if you've ever been to China, right, or really any other country in Asia, it's very diverse, right? There are multiple ethnicities. China is extremely diverse. Even among the so-called Han majority in China, you get a huge amount of linguistic diversity. You go 100 miles outside of Beijing, you stop being able to understand the people. And so this is something that they talk about. They think nationalism, nation building is a straightforward process in Asia, right? Because the writing system seems to be unified, right? Chinese characters. The people seem to be all of the same ethnicity, right? In each country. And what I want to do, right, with my sort of contrasting model, integrationist model, very top-down, very state-led, very sort of elite-driven, right, is to overturn that notion that Asia is homogeneous, and therefore nation building is easier, right? Easy or easier at least than sort of the more familiar cases like France, like England, Germany, these places, right? It took a lot of constructing, right? Constructing new traditions, constructing new languages, constructing new ideas of community, right? Of nation building in Asia in order to create what we see, the borders, right? And the boundaries, the social boundaries that we see today, right? So really, right, what we're talking about during this time period, right, is China versus its neighbors, right, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. And what we're really talking about is the decentering of China, right, the sort of rejection of Chinese culture as foreign, right. Originally, classical Chinese, like Latin, is this transnational language, right. It's not seen as necessarily belonging to a particular people or a particular culture, right. It is simply the language of truth, right. It's the language of the Confucian canon, right. Both Korea and Vietnam had civil examination systems modeled on the one in China, right? But these were all abolished within about 20 years of each other in the 1890s and the early 1900s. And so a lot of this is about decentering China and recentering themselves, right? But what about themselves are they going to be centering? So that's where the story begins. We really need to start with Japan, right? And before I start with telling the story of Japan, I should do a brief side note about methods, right? So if you really wanted to do hardcore historical research, right, using primary sources on these 3, maybe 4 countries, right, you would probably need 4 lifetimes, right? You would need to learn at least 4 languages, right? And each language you would need to learn in multiple historical forms, right? When I start to tell the story about Japan, you'll see that there are at least 4 or 5 different kinds of writing that they're really arguing about, right? Which one of these really is Japanese, right? And so you'd have to be familiar with that, right? You'd have to be familiar with Korean, right? And you'd have to be familiar with Vietnamese. You'd have to be familiar with Vietnamese written in Latin letters, and you'd have to be familiar with Vietnamese written in Chinese characters, and you'd have to be familiar with Vietnamese written in its own sort of Chinese character adaptation, right? So it would be really hard to do primary research. So what is this project I'm going to share with you today? It's really old-fashioned comparative historical sociology, entirely based on secondary sources, okay? And also mostly based on secondary sources in English, right? And that gives you some strengths, and it also gives you some weaknesses, right? The strength is you get to do it on this macro level, right? A lot of histories are done on a micro level because you have access to a particular archive, or particular set of diaries, or particular set of sources, and you can, talk about, wheat cultivation in a remote province in Japan, in 4 years, right, in the 18th century. That's one kind of history, right? Or, sort of Jonathan Spence-style Chinese history, the death of woman Wang, one murder case, right? In the span of a few months, right? And then he tells the story of the background of this woman. And that's fascinating. But if you zoom out, right, and you talk about something over the course of 1,000 years, right, it's really hard to do primary research. So the sort of broader view is the advantage to this method. The weakness is obvious, right? The weakness is my story will become as outdated as the historiography that it's based on, right? And when I'm telling the story of Japan, you'll notice that a lot of the historiography is mid-20th century American historiography of Japan, right? Back when Japanese studies was having its moment. Japanese studies is having a difficult moment now because of, the same historical forces that propelled Japan into sort of the forefront of American anxiety, right? In the 70s, 80s, and 90s, Japan will overtake America, Japan #1. There was a book called Japan #1 back in 1990, I think. That's what really propelled Japan studies in the United States, and now it's receded because, there's another country that the United States is worried about. So what we're getting is post-World War II, right? Very impact response, right? European impact, Japanese response, historiography. That's usually how the story is told. You get a similar sort of historiography with mid-century Chinese historiography, right? So John King Fairbank, for example, Joseph Levinson, one of his students, they have this very sort of, American, British, French, German, Austrian, Japanese impact on China, and then what does China do in response, right? The current trend in Chinese history is, taking China on its own terms, right? Seeing how it adapted to changing circumstances. But, if we really want to talk about the story of language reform or transformation of language in Asia, we have to start with Japan. And we have to start with the classic moment of encounter, which is the Perry expedition in 1853, right? So Commodore Matthew Perry sails into Edo Bay, Tokyo Bay, right? And he threatens the Japanese with destruction if they don't open their ports to trade, right? So that raises a number of questions, right? Why the Americans, right? Why not the British? The British were the first into China. The British were the ones to threaten, Canton or Guangzhou with destruction if they didn't open up to trade, right? And the reason is economic, right? China was the bigger market. The British and the other Europeans were paying much more attention to China than Japan. Japan was this small set of islands off to the side, right? Not very interesting. And the British already, in the 1840s, were talking about opening up Japan, right? And actually, there's a whole literature on the ideology of free trade that was like going through, it started with the Scottish Enlightenment, Adam Smith, right? And so why do the Europeans feel entitled to break in, right? Well, they think it's selfish, right? They think it's immoral of the Asians to keep their markets closed, right? And there's a lot of profit incentive to open these ports up for trade, but there's also a national security incentive. One of the things that Matthew Perry was asking for was coal refueling stations, right? So if you get that permission from the Japanese government, you can land your ships on Japanese ports, and refuel, right, without worry of being attacked, which is what used to happen, right? And so he goes in, and this precipitates a political crisis in Japan, right? And so usually it's lumped under the rubric of the Meiji Restoration, right? And what was happening was, right, under the previous regime, the Tokugawa shogunate, you have sort of, a king and a pope, right? In Japan, you have the emperor who's in Kyoto, a very symbolic figurehead, right? Unbroken line of succession for the past several thousand years. But the real power is in Edo, right? Today's Tokyo, the shogun, right? Which is when you pronounce the Chinese characters, it's Jiangjun, which is general in Chinese. But the shogun is the real power, right? And so, what is being restored in the Meiji Restoration? Well, the Emperor Meiji, right, is pushed by a group of rebellious nobles from two small southern provinces in Japan to become the actual ruler, right? Although Japan is ruled by an oligarchy of nobles, in reality after that time. So there's a sort of conservative revolution in Japan, right? It's not a sort of peasant uprising. It's one set of elites against another, right? And it's basically which set of elites is going to modernize Japan. It's not about, something, tradition versus modernity. It's about who's going to be in charge, right? And so after the Meiji Restoration, you have this new group in charge, and they want to modernize Japan. And one of the things that needs to be modernized is the language, because they think that Japan is backwards because everyone's illiterate, right? Only a small set of people can read and write. And in prior centuries, this would have been seen as a feature, right? Why would you teach the peasants to read and write? They'll just make trouble, right? You get the same kind of attitude in Europe before the 18th century, right? Why do these people who toil and growing our food all day need to get introduced to newfangled ideas? Best let sleeping dogs lie. But in this new era, right, national strength, military strength, economic development comes from having a literate populace, right? How can you have people working in factories, dealing with munitions, right, on ships, if they can't read the manual, right, on how to operate dangerous machinery or things like that? So one of the earliest reformers, his name is Mori Arinori, right? And a famous book to come out of this exchange with Western intellectuals is Education in Japan, which was published in English also in 1873, right? And one of the people he corresponded with in this collection of letters, right, is a Sanskritist, right, named William Dwight Whitney, who was a scholar at Yale. And so what does Sanskrit have to do with anything, right? Well, Sanskrit will come into play later when we talk about the new science of linguistics, which at the time really sort of was rooted in philology, right? Philology is this field that compares ancient texts, and it's sort of where we start getting our ideas of linguistic evolution, right? Language changes over time, and it branches out, and it becomes more diverse, right? And so Sanskrit was one of the most influential languages in this process because a British man named William Jones was most famous for identifying how similar Sanskrit roots were with Greek and Latin, right? And so that's where you get today's sort of Indo-European language family, that they were able to deduce there was a common ancestor. So William Dwight Whitney is part of this trend in the 19th century at the time, and Mori Arinori writes a letter to him asking, well, what should we do about language in Japan? It's very complicated. People are using classical Chinese, but the mass of the people are, speaking multiple different dialects of Japanese and are illiterate. And Whitney's response is, you should use English, right, as an elite language, right, and for science, for scholarship, and then you can use Japanese in everyday life, right? And you sort of get strange echoes of that now, right? I'm delivering this talk in Taipei, right, in English to a multilingual audience, and all of my colleagues have a very excellent English. It's a very strange sort of English language academic hegemony kind of situation today, but we get this suggestion, right? And this story gets transmuted into a very strange form, right? That people often in the literature will say that the Japanese considered just switching to English because English was modern. That's not true. That's not what Whitney was advocating at the time. And ultimately it doesn't come to fruition, right? But you get other suggestions for reform at the time. There's a lot of debate, right? So there are several societies formed for the reform of Japanese writing, right? And one of them is the Meiji Six Society, right? Meirokusha, which is named for, it was founded in the 6th year of the Meiji reign, so that's why it's named that, right? And they wanted to simplify the writing system, right? Originally, you get classical Chinese on top, and then various forms of classical Japanese writing on the bottom, sort of below that in prestige, right? And one of the founding members of the Meiji Six Society is Fukuzawa Yukichi. I do not want to teach on what is okay. And he's most famous for he's famous for a number of things. One of the things he's famous for is he's one of the founders of Keio University, right? One of the sort of earliest sort of Western-style centers of learning in Japan, right? You also get a series of kana societies that argue that Japanese should only be written in kana, right? The sort of syllabic, the two different syllabic sets of symbols that were used in different kinds of sort of vernacular literature before the 19th century. And so, 3 different societies, kana no tomo, right? The friends of kana, right? Or there are 2 similarly named Iroha societies. Iroha was the first 3 syllables of the poem that set out all of the symbols of the syllabary without repeating one of them once. So it's a poem about fragrance and flowers, and it's very different from the way that kana are arranged today, the sort of a, I, u, e, o sort of model, which is actually modeled on Sanskrit. So that's a 19th century innovation, right? The sort of alphabetical order in Japanese is a 19th century innovation. So that's why these societies are named Iroha, right? They had a very different way of organizing these syllables before the 19th century. And then the final society that I will talk about is the Romaji society, which is basically advocating that Latin letters should replace Japanese writing, right? So there were a lot of ideas, right? And you get similar ideas in China at the time, too. People were saying, we should just spell out Chinese. It's too difficult. Chinese characters are too hard to learn. They're too complicated. They should be abolished. They're an impediment to mass literacy. So all of these ideas are being bandied about at the time. Oh, why do I have a currency note here? That's Fukuzawa Yukichi, right? So he's on the 10,000 yen note now. So in case you ever go. So basically, that's script, right? But what is that script supposed to be representing, right? Latin letters can represent many different languages, right? Chinese characters can also be used to write different languages. And so there are several layers of language, several layers of writing going on in Japan in the 19th century, right? The most prestigious form is kanbun, right? Which is classical Chinese, basically, right? But you also have different other forms of writing. So babun, right? Which, written entirely in kana, right? Dating to the Heian period, right? More than 1,000 years ago, right? Famous, I think Tale of Genji is written in babun. It's written entirely in hiragana, right? So it's a sort of associated with women, right? Because the author is a woman. And that's one form of classical Japanese that was available to people at the time, right? Another form, right? Sorobun, right? Is an epistolary style, right? It's a letter writing style. Dating from centuries ago, right? So named because the copula, right, the verb equivalent to be is soro, right, this character, ho. And so that was in frequent use among the educated elite at the time in 19th century Japan. And then finally, right, you have this sort of mixed form, right, wa kan kon ko bun, right, which is, as from the name you can see, he han hun yao wen, right, it's a sort of mixture of Chinese characters and Japanese sort of lexical items, vocabulary, mixed together, often used in bureaucratic writing at the time, right? And so I just put this is a very cute book. I highly recommend it. It's been in English translation for more than a century, or very many decades. So it's a book called I Am a Cat by Natsume Soseki. And it was published in 1906, right? But the reason why I put it on here is because it's an illustration of the transition, the sort of huge transition in Japanese language practices at the time, right? So, if you were to say I'm a cat in modern Japanese, you would expect, watashi wa neko desu, right? But what we have here is wagahai wa neko de aru, right? Which wagahai is a very pompous way of saying I, right? It's almost like the Chinese zhen, right? It's which is a pronoun only used by the emperor. And so this is a pronoun only used by nobles in Japan, right? And dearu is the verb associated with it. And so, to be. And so what level of linguistic transformation are we talking about? We're not talking about Shakespeare to now, right? That's sort of a stylistic difference. There's some linguistic, grammatical changes between Elizabethan English and now, but you can sort of get the sense of it, right? We're talking about an utter transformation, right? We're talking about what is the verb to be going to be, right? It's a huge transformation from traditional to modern practices at this time, right? So this is published in 1906. Really, by this time, no novels are published in any other kind of language other than modern Japanese. And so, in essence, he's making fun of this earlier form of speaking, right? He wants to make the cat sound pompous. So the whole book is written from the point of view of the cat, right? And the cat is making fun of its master. And the cat thinks that humans are ridiculous. And so that's why you have the title styled the way it is. Okay, so what are we moving towards, right? We're moving away from these multiple traditional practices. We're moving towards, right, genbun ichi, right? So the congruence of writing and speech, right? So this is a feature of Asian languages, or the Asian languages that I'll be talking about today, that hasn't actually disappeared with modernity, which is the division between writing and speech. So if you want to translate the word language, right, from English into Chinese, you get 语言文字, right? But that's 语言 is spoken language, 文字 is, right? So it's a combination of the two, right? But a new idea was coming in from Europe at the time, right? And it comes from a school of German philologists, whom we might now term linguists, right? Known as the neo-grammarians, right? The Jung Grammatica, right? And the idea that they have is phonocentrism, right? And so the field of linguistics right now, hopefully there are no linguists in the room, but I would characterize it as phonocentric, right? And what does phonocentric mean? Well, it means centering the sounds, the phones, right, of a language. And the idea is real language is spoken, right? Language is sound, right, produced by a human, right? Writing is just a visual representation of that. It's just auxiliary to the sound, right? This is a very different ideology. It's a very different set of assumptions from what you have in, say, China at the time, which is writing is its own thing, right? Writing is independent. And in practice, it was, right? Classical Chinese can be read in many different ways, right? You can pronounce these words in a Japanese style, Vietnamese style, Korean style. You can pronounce it in multiple, dozens of dialects in China, right? It doesn't matter how it sounds, because if you order the characters in a particular way and you understand them to mean specific things, right, then you can read it in any number of ways and derive basically the same meaning, right? And so writing is very independent in Chinese linguistic thinking up until the 19th century, right? But when you get to phonocentrism, right, the heart of the language is no longer the writing is not important, right? And so when they're arguing about writing, right, really what they're arguing about is language. What is this writing supposed to be representing? Should it be unified with the sounds, right? So this is a debate that happens in Japan, Korea, China, and Vietnam at the time, right? Because if you're going to move away from classical Chinese, you need to move to something that you think is modern, right? And what you think is modern is probably going to be spoken, okay? So this idea filters through a guy named Ueda Kazutoshi, who was able to study with the leading neo-grammarians in Berlin and Leipzig in the 1890s. You know, Germany was a scientific and educational center at the time. Most American PhDs were trained in Germany at the time. And you know, not only did he get these ideas about linguistics, he also got German Romantic ideas that language is the soul of the nation, right? So language really represents the spirit of a defined people. And so these ideas are filtering through Japan at the time, also through another big figure named Maejima Hisoka, who is also known as the founder of Japan's postal system, featured on postal stamps in Japan, and also one of the founders of Waseda University. He also had time to make millions of dollars in railroads. So he was a polymath. It was a really great time to be born. And so he and with that, right, are founding members of a government institution known as the Kokugo Chosa Iinkai, right, the National Language Research Council, right? And this is the first instance in this presentation of this idea, Kokugo, right? And we're going to see this phrase repeated in Korea and Vietnam, as well as China at the time. So Kokugo is a really strange term, right? It means, in its original sort of meaning, right, before its transformation in the 19th century in sort of this nationalist era, right, its original meaning is language of a place, right? It's just a place, language, right? And so in China, right, 国语 has a very strange meaning in sort of late Qing dynasty government circles. It really means Manchu, right? And so this word, right, is transformed. It's transformed into national language, right? And so it goes through the same transformation in the other three countries as well, right? And so what they're trying to create is something for all people, right? It's not just for a literate, educated, you know, bureaucratic elite, right? It's something that needs to be spread to everybody. And so this is sort of the story of nationalism as a modern phenomenon, right? You get this transnational elite, right, breaking down along national lines, and then you get this sort of breaking down of class, right? So you're substituting race or nation for class at this point. And so that's the sociological story that I would like to tell as we go through these countries. And so the government and the elites that run it play a big role in creating this new language. And what do they settle on, right? A mixture of kanji, right, Chinese characters, and kana, right? So up until World War II, mostly katakana, the sort of angular version of it, right? And then after World War II, you get a simplification of kanji, and then more hiragana, right? The curly, spirally one. And so it's a fairly conservative reform, right? It's elite Tokyo dialect, right, with some Kyoto thrown in, right, and spread through a mass education system, right, and also propagated through mass media. You got a sort of enormous rise in newspapers and other periodicals in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries in Japan, a story that will be repeated in the other countries as well, right? So Japan is the pioneer, and it's very influential in other countries, right? So Japan gets a dose of gunboat diplomacy from the Americans, right, in 1853, right, and Japan repeats this same behavior to the Koreans in 1875, right? They send in gunboats and they say, you must open your ports or we'll destroy your fort. And the Koreans say no, and then the fort gets destroyed, and so Japan starts to encroach in in Korean politics increasingly deeply after this Ganghwa Island incident in 1875, where Japan tries to force Korea to cease its tributary relation with the Qing dynasty. And nothing really gets done. The Koreans sign this treaty. They're like, screw you, we're not going to follow this. But in the meantime, right, they start sending out missions to other countries, such as Japan. The students start to study in Japan at the time to try to see what's going on in Japan that makes them more powerful than the Koreans. And so the most familiar thing with Korean writing that we know, you've probably all seen, is Hangul, right, the Korean alphabet. It's arranged in blocks, right? It's invented in the 1440s under the famous King Sejong, right? But originally, it's only meant to gloss Chinese characters, right? The title of the original treatise teaching people how to do Hangul is called Hunmin Cheongum, right? 训民正音. So teaching the people the correct pronunciations, the correct sounds of Chinese characters, right? So it's not supposed to be an independent system of writing. Even so, the bureaucratic elite in Korea were threatened by this, right? They thought that this, would sort of plebeianize, sort of peasantize writing, and so they, in reaction, and in no other country do you see this, they started naming classical Chinese writing 亲色, right? 真书, which is, or 亲文, right? True writing, right? Versus this 언문, right? Vernacular, right? Sort of not official writing. It's only until the 19th century that you get reform, right? So 亲色, right, this true writing, transforms into a new term, which is very similar to the Japanese one. It's transferred into Hanmun, right, which means Chinese writing. So suddenly you've started to decenter this writing, right? You've made it foreign. It's now the writing of a different country. And what do they call their own writing, right? Kungmun, right, which is national writing. And so the change in terminology is a reflection of the change in ideology, right? And then you get a repeat of this 国语 word, right? 国歌, right? Which is national speech. And so they also, start using the slogan 언문일치 or genbun일치, which is the congruence of speech and writing, right? And so in the 1880s and 1890s, you get a more mixed form of writing. And so from this 1906, actually Japanese produced textbook. So you can see that the Japanese had taken control of the Ministry of Education in Korea, even before they colonized it. It's very strange. But you see a mixed writing. It almost looks like Japanese, right? So you get a lot of nouns in Chinese, and then you get these grammatical particles, right, written in Hangul, right, written in the Korean alphabet. And so you see an increasing amount of this kind of writing at the time, right? And in my research, in my dissertation, right, I encountered the First Sino-Japanese War, which was very precipitating in Chinese language reform, right? But why did the Japanese fight the Chinese in 1895, right? Well, it starts in Korea. So the Tonghak Rebellion, right, was a peasant rebellion that started in the Cholla province in Korea. Really, the proximate cause was a corrupt official. The peasants rose up. The government wasn't able to quell the rebellion, so they asked the Qing for help, right? The Qing said yes. The Japanese, who had already signed a treaty with the Koreans, were not happy about this because they wanted to increase their influence on the Korean peninsula. So the Japanese come in and do what the Korean government could not do, which is to squash the rebellion, right? But they used this opportunity to also take further control of the government in Seoul. And so what precipitates is Japanese-induced, right? So we're not just talking about nation states. At this point, we're also talking about empires. Because this imperialism is now stemming from the Japanese themselves, and so you get the Kabul reforms, which is an interesting echo of the Chinese name of this war, 甲午战争, which is the name of the sexagenary cycle that's used to name years. It's a 60-year cycle. And so it's also 甲午改革in Korea, and all sorts of government practices are reformed. You know, marriage is reformed, the civil service is reformed, the civil examinations are abolished in 1894, right? So they had the same way of recruiting officials as in China, but it's abolished in 1894. In China, it's not abolished until 1905, right? So it's actually earlier, this development happens earlier in Korea, and this is important because people spent decades studying for this exam. They had to learn all of the Confucian classics, they had to learn it in classical Chinese, they had to write their exam in Chinese, right? And once you take that away, right, the value of the language goes way down, right? Why would you spend decades studying for something that's not going to get you any sort of prestige, any sort of return, right? And so one of the slogans running through intellectual society at this time is also a Japanese-influenced phrase, right? 문용케화, right? Which is, you know, civilization and opening, right? And so what you get in the 1890s, right, is one of the first vernacular newspapers. So the media really, really plays a significant role, right? Even though it's just a very small beginning in Korea, right? This newspaper, the Tongnip Shinmun, right, is the first paper to be written entirely without Chinese characters, right? And it was only published between 1896 and 1899. The circulation was only about 2,000 or 3,000 at a time, right? So it was reaching a very small audience. But it's very, very innovative, right? And it was founded by two people who had studied abroad, right, in the United States. Philip Jason, Se Chepil, right, and Yoon Chi-ho, right, who was a very sort of strongly Christian ideologist. And the manifesto of this paper was to be able to reach the masses, right? So reading is not any longer the exclusive province of the elite, right? So after the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese used the sort of exigencies of the war to take further control of Korea, right? The Ulsa Treaty makes Korea a protectorate of Japan in 1905. At the same time, during all of this high drama, right, the founder of Korean linguistics, Chu Si-kyung, right, establishes the National Script Research Center under government auspices, right? So they're trying to reform writing in Korea at the time. But annexation happens, you know, total control, Japanese control happens in 1910, right? And so it's up to his students to establish the Chosuneo Yongguhae, the Korean Language Research Association in 1921, right? So they continue this during the colonial era, right? But really the Japanese sort of forecloses a lot of reform after 1910 all the way up until their defeat in World War II in 1945, because the amount of Korean language education in Korea at the time is decreasing, right? It's demoted from the medium of education to just one subject in school, right? Until the late 30s when it's completely abolished, right? So Japanese education sort of supplants Korean education at this time. So a lot of the developments in Korea, right, must happen after World War II, right? When, you know, you get a further demotion of Chinese characters within Korean writing. Even in the 60s and 70s, you could see a lot of Chinese characters in Korean newspapers, the sort of same style that I showed you earlier. But today, really, it's almost exclusively alphabetical. And so it's something that, you know, happens in a colonial space, right? And when we talk about things happening in colonial spaces, right, we really have to include Vietnam, right? The French, right, were there for a long time, right? And there were many different forms of writing in Vietnam at the time. there was classical Chinese as a bureaucratic and elite language, right? There was a civil examination system that tested people on these Confucian classics, but there was also a vernacular literature, right? And this vernacular was written in a set of characters called chunom, right? So this is probably the most butchering part of the presentation. This is the furthest out of my comfort zone. I've asked, yeah. Zenom, yeah. So see, and I've asked Vietnamese Vietnam historians to teach me, and it's just the fourth language is is really hard. But anyhow, it has a very interesting set of invented characters, right, for local purposes, right? And what you get are phono-semantic compounds, right? So in Japanese, you get natively invented characters too, and also in Korea, usually for very local things. In Vietnam, you get thousands of these, right? And you get an entire literature written in them. And a phono-semantic compound is like, this is the number 3, right? But ba is the phonological sort of clue to it, and the 3 is the meaning hint, right? So there are a lot of these characters. The character for pho is the same, right? It's rice plus phonetic component. So you got thousands of these characters, right? You have a vernacular literature all the way into the 19th century, right below classical Chinese, right? But that's not how Vietnamese is written today. It's written in Latin. It's written in the Latin alphabet, right? And so the name you usually see cited for this, right, is a French Jesuit missionary named Alexandre de Rhodes, right, who produced a dictionary in 1651, which was published in Rome, right? But he's not the inventor, right? So the missionaries were probably trying to reach out to population, to proselytize, to preach their religion, and they needed a tool to communicate, right, in writing. And so this sort of Latin alphabet system was developed in the 17th century. But it's really dormant until the 19th century. The next dictionary that's produced by missionaries is only published in 1838, right? It's probably still used by some Catholic communities in Vietnam at the time, right? But it really doesn't come into its own until after the French come in and take over, right? So the French are there. Why are they there? Because other Europeans are there and they want a trade route into China, right? And so they start in the south. They conquer what they call Tonkin first, right? Then they conquer the middle of the country, Annam, later, and then finally Cochin China, and they rule the country from Hanoi, right? In the 1880s, right? And they also fight a war against the Chinese in 1885, the Sino-French War, and they force China to acknowledge that Vietnam is no longer in its orbit, right? No longer any tributary relations, right? The French really want to break the hold of Chinese political power, but also cultural power at this time, right? And the French think they're doing it for civilizing reasons. They think they're bringing modern technology to the people in Vietnam, right? So at this time, the periodical press also begins to rise, right? The first newspaper published in this new language, right? Well, not new language, new writing system, right? Where do I have it? Oh, yeah. Is known as, okay, you're going to have to say this for me. No, the 国语. 国语 is really a strange term here because it's used often to refer to the writing system, right? So in the other 3 countries, it's used to refer to the spoken language, right? But here it's often used to refer to the Latin letter writing system, right? And so you get this new writing system in a periodical produced by the French government, edited by a genius, right, known as Petruski, who was a Catholic and also sort of government French colonial propagandist at the time, and it's established in Saigon in 1865. Jiading is another name for the city, and it's put into circulation, under state auspices. And the civil examination is also abolished in Vietnam about a decade after it's abolished in China. And so some sort of anti-colonial thinkers, I bring these 2 up because they both studied abroad, right? And they were influenced by Japanese ideas. They were also influenced by the thinking of Liang Qichao and Kang Youwei. And so a lot of these ideas are transnational, right? They're circulating at the time, and a lot of the ideas for reform also come from them, right? And the mass media continues to expand into the 20th century, right? So 1919 to about the 1910s to about 1939, before the Japanese start to invade a lot of countries in Asia, is a relatively relaxed time in Vietnam, right? So the governor, Albert Saho, right, is, oh yeah, there's another language you would need to research Vietnamese history. You would also need French. Yeah, so allows, more than 60 periodicals to be founded in the 1920s alone, right? And so the two of the most famous are Nam Feng, Tap Chi is actually 杂志, is a periodical that sort of plays a large role in the development of this literature written in Latin letters. And La Cloche Filet, right, which is a reference to a poem by Charles Baudelaire, and it means the cracked bell, is another very influential French language sort of pro-independence, anti-colonial periodical at the time. And so the point I'm trying to make is, right, the government promotes this new writing system, right? It promotes this writing system because it wants to break the hold of Chinese, right? It also also French colonial officials don't want to learn Chinese characters. They don't want to learn them, right? And this is a lot easier, right? But then it becomes independent of the French, right? It takes on a life of its own. And so people use this new tool of communication to promote anti-colonial thought. And so it really outruns the control of the French. So what was originally supposed to be a tool of colonial control becomes a tool of anti-colonial agitation, right? And so, actually, both of the founders of La Cloche Filet I wanted to mention studied in France. So they basically sow the seeds of their own demise, right? And so a lot of this reform happens under the French, right? But in South Vietnam, so after the French are defeated in the 50s, right, South Vietnam is carved out by, Western powers, right? And French remains a very sort of in vogue language in educational circles, right? But after the sort of American withdrawal and the fall of South Vietnam, right, you get this sort of total Vietnamization during this time, right? And so here's another weakness in the American historiography of Vietnam. It's usually colored by the traumatic experience of withdrawal from Vietnam and military defeat, right? Still the best source on this, right? There's not that much in English on, so a lot of it, there's probably a huge literature in Vietnamese, but there's not very much in English. The best book is still by a sinologist who also didn't speak Vietnamese. His name is John DeFrancis. He was at the University of Hawaii, Manoa for decades. And he used Vietnamese language consultants to write this book, but he was a leftist. He was very pro-North Vietnam. And so those are the controversies you see play out in the English language literature on Vietnam, because the other set of people writing about Vietnam that I was reading while I was doing this project were former soldiers in the US Army, right? And they were there, they were not necessarily pro-American, right? They became disillusioned with the war, right? And they were like, we need to learn more about what we're doing here. We don't know why we're here. Anyhow, so that's sort of the progression in Vietnam, right? So a lot of cosmopolitanism, right? You go from elite cosmopolitanism to this sort of new intellectual class that's circulating among these countries and also the West, right? To promote new and very different ideas about language, right? And so you get a shrinking, right, of horizons, right? From sort of a transnational elite language to national mass language, right? And the rise of nationalism, that's a part of, right? And so we're talking about nation states, right? We're talking about states that are building nations, right? You don't have a nation of Chinese speakers, Japanese speakers, Korean speakers, or even Vietnamese speakers until the state really comes in and sort of puts that idea out there and tries to bring reality into conformity with these ideals, right? We're talking about nation states, but we're also talking about empire states, right? We're talking about the French, who also played a role in this. We're talking about the Japanese and Korea, who also played a role in sort of stoking anti-colonial, right, ideas about who should rule a nation and what the sort of practices within this nation should look like. And so that's the story I hope to tell today. I hope it was helpful. Thank you very much.
非常谢谢 Jeff， 真的非常精彩的演讲。我想在那个社会学界，真的很少有从语言的角度然后来看那个东亚非常重要的 变迁哈。那这是精彩的研究。那我们接下来就是要开放讨论。Now we open the discussion to the floor. You can see that Jeff is multilingual, so please raise your questions in any language, right? OK， 我们可以还有线上的朋友也欢迎问问题。所以我们就是收集几个问题，好，然后再请 Jeff 一起回应，好吗？好，那在场的朋友有没有什么问题？好，请先简单介绍一下自己，好不好？好，然后再问问题，然后问题简短。
感谢 Jeff 今天非常精彩的演讲。那我用中文提问，然后等下可能再简单翻译一下。我是台大政治所的苏留迪生。那目前我想要去读河内法律大学，所以我也是会越南文。那我想问的问题是，我有读过成大台文所的蒋伟文教授，他是本身是一个台语罗马字的一个提倡者。那他有一个很大的启发是来自于越南文是如何从刚刚说汉字、汉南字，然后采用罗马字这个过程。但我自己读完他的论述以后，发现好像其实台语罗马字跟这个越南的罗马字的过程其实差很多，好像可以学习的地方真的不是很多。那这样的问题，我想请问 Jeff， 不知道你看法如何？感谢。
好，谢谢这位朋友的问题，非常谢谢。那好，那个长玲，
好，你好，我是台大政治系黄长玲，非常精彩哈。但我有2个问题，那一个事实上是说，在你 present 的这一段时间里头，就是你 cover 的这个 historical period， 其实中国内部也有 vernacular movement。所以我会觉得它其实是一个 interesting 的 reference， 因为当时你譬如说像54的健将，像陈独秀，他年轻的时候在54之前，他就在他的故乡安徽出版一个报纸叫《安徽俗话报》。其实那个概念有点像我们今天看香港的所谓的中文的报纸。那我们譬如说台湾人看不懂香港，就说用广东话写的，但是它其实也是汉字 base。所以在19世纪的末年到20世纪初期，其实中国内部的 elite， 就是说在这个54的前后，其实他们在他们自己各省也在做类似的事情。好，那这个东西其实会回到你的这个 theme 来讲的话，其实它的差别其实就是那一些各省，它其实没有一个足够的政治力，使得这件事情成为一个 unified 的 written system。那这是第一个。第二个就是说，我觉得你这个 integrationist， 你现在提到的这几个东西，其实都非常的这个有趣。但是伴随这些东西，因为你其实是要complement 或者 de-emphasize， 就是说如果我的理解没有错的话，这个 Eric Hobsbawm 跟这个 Ben Anderson 他们强调 modernization 的那个部分，就是那个 capitalist force 或者 capitalist modernization 的这个部分。但伴随这些所有的这一些重要的 historical force 以外，其实还同时，其实也有一个东西是 democracy。那这个 democracy 其实如果是在，我想其他国家我不是很熟悉，但是在韩文里头非常清楚，因为韩文里头就是说用这个怎么讲 Hangul， 好，就是中文书写就是你刚刚讲的谚文，就是用 Hangul 跟用汉甲用汉字。其实它有阶级的意义以外，其实它甚至也有性别的意义。早年就是说，男人就是知识阶级，所以可以写汉字；但是女人的话，其实就写就是说这个 Hangul。那 Hangul 其实事实上是一个拼音文字嘛，所以就是说，它一旦它就比较能够所谓的我手写我口。这个是其实54的时候白话文运动的那个概念，所以我觉得其实这个部分我是不知道你怎么考量。那这就是我的2个问题。
好，谢谢这2个问题哈，一个是中国内部各省的这个语言改造运动，另外一个是有关民主问题。你要这2个
用中文去回答还是用
都可以？
用英文回答？用英文回答吧。我就Okay, so the first question was about Taiwanese romanization and the romanization compared with romanization in Vietnam. So romanizations are really interesting. They're a lot has been written about them because a lot of the origins of these are from missionaries, right? And so when missionaries came to Asia, right, they were very confused by the language situation, right? The elites wrote something, and then everybody else spoke something else, right? But they had to reach everybody else. And so how do you reach everybody else? You invent a romanization for them, right? So you get a lot of dialect romanizations in China. You get romanizations, you get the first dictionaries in Korean, right, from missionaries, not from Koreans, right? The first monolingual Korean dictionary was actually produced in the 30s. And so romanizations are controversial, right, because the people who know characters are very threatened by them, right? They're too easy, right? And then the argument is you cannot adequately represent Chinese in Hanyu Pinyin, for example, or any other kind of pinyin. But it just really, that's the deeper question is what kind of Chinese are you representing, right? You cannot write classical Chinese in Hanyu Pinyin, but you could probably write anything you say, you can probably write using an alphabetical system, and it can probably be intelligible, right? Chinese characters are not words, right? The words are 2-character, 3-character combinations, right? And so usually in Hanyu Pinyin, they're connected, right? You can actually see this in written Korean. There are spaces between words. So it's really helpful. That's why Chinese is so hard to read, even for me, because you have to supply the spaces between the words, because everything's not, it's a scripta continua. There are no spaces. And so I'm not sure what to say about romanizations besides the fact that it's been done a lot. A lot of the origins were religious, and it's doable, right? It's doable, but you'd have to probably even further sort of 口语化 to sort of vernacularize, make the language much more closer to its spoken counterpart. And so the distance between writing and speaking in Asia is still kind of greater than what you might get elsewhere. With China, the story, there's a lot on vernacular language press, the rise of the vernacular press in China. You do get things like Suzhou Baihua Bao, or a lot of place name plus Baihua Bao, and in the late 19th century, and they're trying to reach a bigger audience, right? So they're trying to produce a market, but a lot of these things don't survive. There's a movement towards dialect literature in Eastern China, in the sort of the Shanghai region in the 1930s, also, but I think the weakness of these attempts is sort of no government backing, right? So there's a linguist, an American Jewish linguist named Max Weinreich, who did a lot of work on Yiddish in Eastern Europe in the 60s. The joke that he came up with, well, it's usually attributed to him, no one really knows where it came from, is that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy, right? And so everything's a dialect, right? But what is a language? Well, it has to be made official by something, right? It has to be backed by power, and it has to be backed by a power that's legitimate. And so that's the point about democracy is really interesting. So there's a question about sort of, is it just about capitalism and modernization when it comes to nation building, a la Hobsbawm and Anderson, or is there an element of democracy? And I think that's a great question because it's about legitimacy, right? The legitimacy of the Qing government wasn't based on the consent of the people, right? It was based on, a different kind of ideology, right? They had the mandate of heaven, right? They also had the force of arms, and they came and they conquered, right? And they created one of the largest empires in Chinese history, which is very impressive, right? But it's not a nation state, right? It's not, we're the same as you, so therefore we have a right to rule you. It's actually, we're quite different from you, therefore we have a right to rule you. We're better than you. That's the ruling ideology, right? So there's not, when I'm talking about class difference between ruled and rulers and ruled, right? There's almost a racial divide, right? The nobles think that they're better, right? They're born better. And so democracy really does come into this because, nationalism is a totally different sort of legitimacy. It's, we're the same, right? And you choose us to rule you. So therefore, even the People's Republic of China, the nationalism there, the government claims to represent the people, right? It's not, they're better than everybody else, even though, whatever. I'm not going to, this is being broadcast. So there's that, and I think the point about gender is incredibly important because, so there's a question about, is Hangul gendered, right? Is hiragana gendered? Yes, right? So, women don't have the access to the same kinds of educational resources for centuries, right? And so there is a gendered aspect. It seems that the easier forms of writing are reserved for women, right? The vernacular literature is reserved for women. And so the sort of erasure of this sort of literacy divide is also an important feature of sort of an imagined sort of nationalist modernity at this time. So I think that's definitely an important point. So thank you for that question. Yes.
还有没有第二波的问题 ？Any other questions? And do we have any questions online? 有没有任何的问题？简单的问题也可以。历史过程很复杂哈，对。Any questions for Jeff? 好，清湖。我们线上有问题。
My question is probably very naive, and I'm a little bit lost, at the very end. Maybe because I'm too fascinated by your language ability and your historical knowledge that, I'm a little bit lost. So at the end, I'm thinking about the gist of what you're saying. So is it that you're describing how languages change due to the macro political environment, beginning with, the Chinese hegemony, and then how, colonialism and also local languages rise. And then at the end, they are like a mix of everything. So I just wonder, so are there differences between different cases and that you highlighted, like Japan, Korea, and Vietnam? Are there differences between cases? And also, within the case, are there also differences? Like just now, our friend here said Changli, sorry. Changli talked about like gender differences. So what about like class? What about, different people in different regions? So I'm just thinking, from a, more methodological perspective, like within country differences and between country differences. Can you elaborate a little bit more about that? Thank you.
好，谢谢。还有没有其他问题？郝明修。
我问一个小问题，就是说，你一开始想要比较那个 diffusionist model 跟 integrationist model， 我的感觉好像前者比较是自发的由下而上，后者你比较强调是由上而下哦。那我的感觉是有点，好像这个差异有点被夸大了啦。就是说我自己了解，比如说当代英文，大家都是 King James Bible 嘛。那为什么英国要翻译 King James Bible？ 是因为英国要建立国教嘛，它要独立于那个罗马天主教。然后包括现代的法文也是法兰西学院。是一个政府支持的学院，它是把那个法兰西法文的标准化哈，所以我会觉得说，这两段历史，因为你要讲的那个之前那个 Hobsbawm 啊，或者是 Anderson， 他们讲的都是欧洲的历史嘛，但这个欧洲历史其实有一段是政府介入，但是当你讲到这个亚洲这边的时候，你看到是政府嘛，国家介入，但是我觉得，即使在还原到西方的时候，我觉得那个其实还是国家的那个影子还是存在的，所以我觉得好像。我又回到你那个两个 model 对立，是真的有那么差异那么大吗？
这两个都跟你的 model 有关系啊。
So I'll answer the two questions in order. So the first question was about, it was methodological and a little bit theoretical about comparisons among the countries. So how do we do these comparisons? Japan is clearly the pioneer, so there's a temporal difference, right? So Japan is earlier. In fact, it's about a decade or two earlier than everyone else, and it spurs change in other countries, right? So Japan, everyone's influenced by the West, right? But Japan influences everybody else, right? So the reverse influence is not sort of discussed in the literature, although maybe there is, and it's just that I'm blind to it. And so between countries, also there's the problem with colonialism, right? So you have, if we include China, you have four cases, right? If we want to do a sort of comparative methodology, but two of those cases are colonial cases, right? Whereas the other two are not fully colonial, right? The Japanese are able to, so everybody has unequal treaties. Well, the French just totally take over Vietnam, but there are unequal treaties between Western powers and China, Japan, and Korea, right? Korea was really sort of forced to sign these treaties in the 1880s and mostly in the 1880s, before the Japanese came in, to open their ports, right? Open their doors to missionaries also. They really restricted missionaries as well. But the Japanese were able to basically cancel all of these treaties by the 1890s, right? Without a real war. This was before they defeated the Russians, right, in 1904, 1905 in the Russo-Japanese War, right? And you know, that's also a transnational story. Why were the Japanese fighting the Russians? Well, because the Russians were one of the countries that invaded China during the Boxer Rebellion, and so the Russians just stayed in Manchuria for a while, saying that they were defending their rail lines, and the Japanese wanted them out. And everybody thought, you know, these little yellow people, you know, we can't take them seriously, and then the Japanese move in and just sort of totally destroy the Russians. And so this is a huge shock, right? So the first shock, right, is this first Sino-Japanese war, right? And the second shock is the Russo-Japanese war, and it's an even bigger shock because they defeat a Western power. And so Japan is a model, right? And so Japan functions more autonomously than especially the colonial cases, because Japan really is interfering in Korea, right? Even though the Japanese also have a direct influence on the Korean education system, right? So not only do they take over the ministry, they also have educated a new class of intellectuals, right? That have sort of gotten Japanese influence, received Japanese influence in their studies and in their travels. China's similar, right? China's defeated by Japan, right? China also sends people to study in Japan, right? A lot of vocabulary is imported from Japan into Korea, China, and Vietnam. You know, you can't speak modern Chinese without a whole bunch of Japanese phrases, right? So like, I think a lot of these are familiar, like, you know, 社会, right? Society, 经济, economy, 银行, right? Bank, right? A lot, you know, I think, you know, there was no Chinese word for board of education. There's no such thing as a board of education, right? So it's you know, 教育部, right? Originally in 教育 is the Japanese phrase, right? Originally the Ministry of Education in the Qing government was called 学部, right? The sort of board of learning, right? And so a lot of these sort of ideas really are coming from Japan. And so the influence is not reciprocal. The influence is not equal. The power relations are definitely not equal. And so the directionality of the change, I think, is what's influenced by these differences, right? Who's changing what? Who's changing who? Who's influencing who? And then I think it's a longer discussion to do about within country differences. We'll talk another time about that. I'm just gonna punt that one. So the European cases are, the second question was about European cases, right? The sort of more familiar cases to a Western audience, perhaps. And so have I exaggerated the top-down versus bottom-upness of the models? That being, you know, in reference to Anderson and Hobsbawm being much more bottom-up, you know, market-oriented, modernization-oriented, industrialization-oriented, and mine claiming to be more sort of state-driven, elite-driven, top-down. And so there's a mention of English, which is a fascinating case, right? So who's in charge of the English language is an interesting question. Is it the Oxford English Dictionary, right? Is it Merriam-Webster, right? But when I've like named these, you know, dictionary publishing companies, that's already a clue to who's in charge of English, which is private companies, right? And so there is no governmental body regulating the use of English, right? There is government force behind the education system, right? There's an enormous sort of return on being able to speak elite, or so-called, you know, correct English, standard English, right? And there, you know, there's an enormous amount of societal reward for that. But English is a weirdly decentralized kind of thing because there are multiple countries that speak it. There are multiple varieties of English, you know, so it's a, you know, what we would call a pluricentric language, right? More than one center, and you know. The second mention about English was the King James Bible and the Reformation, and that's something I did leave out of the sort of Henri Jean Martin and Lucien Febvre story, the coming of the book story. There's a huge section. The middle of the book is all about the Reformation, right? Why do you want national vernacular languages? Well, you want people. If your ideology is that people should have direct access to God, right? Then they should be able to read the Bible, and so. if we have to teach them Latin in order to read the Bible in Latin translation, right, Jerome's translation, then that's a huge barrier, right, to access. And so let's try to make it much more on the level of, much more accessible at the very least, right? We don't have to teach them a different language and then how to write in that language, right? Or read in that language. Reading and writing are quite different skills. So, so you get Luther, right, who is the sort of main, driver of German vernacularization, right? His language is sort of the model for all the rest. And you also get the printing press really enabling the Reformation to spread. And so the Reformation is a huge influence, for sure, in the rise of European vernaculars. On the other hand, is this government versus government? Is this government versus church? Is this, it's all of the above, right? So it's a quite different process, right? And then there's this sort of print capitalism story that Anderson tells, which is much more market-driven. But how is this market created? Well, it's ambivalent in the story that's usually told in the European historiography. So the most famous book, you'll probably read it in political science courses as well, is Peasants into Frenchmen by Eugene Weber. And the more famous chapter is on railroads, right? The government built a whole bunch of railroads and integrates the country. The two most fun chapters to me are on language and education, right? You travel 50 miles out of Paris, you can't understand a thing in 1840, right? And the government tries to change this, right? It feels threatened by disloyalty, by disunity, by people who speak Breton, by people who speak Béarn, right? By people who speak by people who speak the languages in southern French, which are much more which are closer to Catalan, right? The version of Lord's sighting was by a peasant girl who couldn't speak French. And so, it's a very disunified country, and the government tries to spread this through the schools, but the argument that Weber puts forward is that the schools did less than urbanization, industrialization, and then, of course, we can credit the government to mobilization, right? But sort of forcing it top down was really difficult without a war. And so in China, I think perhaps you can tell the same story, but who created the language in the first place? The state. Right? In France, this sort of Parisian sort of written language is around since the 1500s, right? It's just sort of floating around there, among an educated elite for a while, right? Whereas, the vernacular is highly devalued in China. It's read for fun. It's not, writing per se, right? There is a small market for literate people for these, works of entertainment. But someone had to standardize the language in the first place. And when this was done in China, it was explicitly to build a nation, right? When it was done in France, right, I think it was Richelieu. Richelieu who created he called it the Académie Royale, but it's now the Académie Française, the French Academy, to standardize the language. This is in the 1600s, right? They don't really care if everyone's literate or not. They're just sort of trying to sort of tamp down the influence of the Italians. The French, believe it or not, had an inferiority complex in the 17th century. They thought that their literature was not as developed as the Italians because the Italians were so active during the Renaissance. And so that's what they were trying to do, at least at this elite level. And so this is sort of, at least in the sort of modernization paradigm of nationalism, pre-nationalist. So although it's sort of tending in that direction. So I think you can make arguments either way. How top-down is it really in Europe, or how bottom-up is it really in Europe, and how top-down is it really in Asia? I think what I'm trying to emphasize in Asia is that these languages are created in the first place by governments bent on building nations. And so that's something that's quite remarkable in my view. So thank you.
Hi Jeff， 真的非常精彩的演讲，非常谢谢。第一轮、第二轮我都没有问题，是不是没有问题？是太多问题了。然后我一直在想，如果有机会一定要在这里问一个问题的话，现在就是那个 media， 就是他们在每个地方都有人办报纸、办杂志，他们是谁？当然你有介绍，但因为他们是 elite， 还是跟这个 nation building 是有关的，还是可不可以稍微 elaborate 一下？好，谢谢。
崇拜我的同事了。然后你的这个演讲里面有这个语言本身，可是它要如何？可能你刚才有讲到一点传播啊，要用什么样的印刷，或是用什么样的教育系统，或是你之前讲中国的时候，还有包括声音，也是要有一些科技的基础，然后才能进行。所以这件事情是不是在19世纪跟20世纪的时候特别能够推行这些语言？那我第二个问题是，就我也不知道该怎么问，就是语言是可以评估的吗？我想的是就在我们STS 里面啊，这个时期也是科学传播就是很剧烈的，所以必须要有很多新的语言来描述。比如像 oxygen， 它出来的时候，在中国就是创造氧这个字嘛，可是日文可能就是酸素，是用它的这个成分。然后不用说，日文有很多想要用语言来呈现荷兰文啊，或是德文啊，在他们吸取新知的时候，所以虽然你有一个这个东亚的交流，可是他们的全球化的交流其实也蛮剧烈的吼。那比如说语言这个主角，它有没有不是只是这些社会因素来形塑它，它本身可以变成有一个什么特性，然后用来解释，就它之所以会朝这样的发展。那这样的解释是不是因为太不社会学了，太好像从语言的效用来讲？可是我们如果放在那个时代的那个脉络下面的话，也许也可以解释。像我上课很喜欢讲那个风险啊，风险如果是 risk 的话，只有在汉字里面叫风险了，还维持那个风带来的危险。可是像日文跟韩文都已经变成 risk 了，或是韩文好像也是 risk 直接翻译过了。risk 对，所以那个时代就是更多的国际交流，除了你讲到这些区域，还有外来的帝国之外，所以这语言的一些特性，是不是也使得他们去汉字化变得更可行或者更重要？这是我的问题，谢谢。
So the first question was, who were the founders of these periodicals? One of the one of the things that really sort of made me dizzy during reviewing this paper and writing this presentation was trying to keep all the names straight and who these people were. There are many more people than what I've presented today, obviously. Let's just give an example of these two. So Se Chepil and Yun Chiho. Yun Chiho was born into a Yangpan family, a landowning family. So they definitely had the time and the resources to fund education, right? Especially fund education abroad. Se Chepil was a noble, and so they were elites, right? So they're almost traitors to their class, maybe sort of the FDR phrase, because they're trying to spread what was originally an exclusively elite skill, right? Reading and writing. Let's see. A lot of these Japanese figures are also elites, with the time and the resources to go abroad and to receive education. So it is an elite project, right? It is an intellectual project. The most famous person, my favorite person that I researched for China was Y.R. Zhao Yuanren. He was from a sort of middling family from Yangzhou. And he was able to go to the United States to study at Cornell based on a Boxer Indemnity Fund scholarship. So some of this money was coming from the Qing government, fines to the West, and then recycled it back into China. So yes, definitely elites. So that's definitely the class that we're talking about at this time. The second set of questions is perhaps more sophisticated than I'm able to answer, but I'll do my best. It's about technology and systems. So one of the interesting things about creating a new spoken language is recording technology, right? Which is not available before, say, the 1870s, right? And so some of the sources that I was able to look at during the course of my research were actually, phonograph records, right? So it was a lot of fun to find these records from the 1930s. They're known as 76s because they circulate at 76 revolutions per minute. which means that on a little disk that's really heavy, you can only fit 3 minutes of sound on a side, which is the length of a song. And so you also have to record all in one take because you can't edit back then. And so like if you get it wrong, you have to do it all over again. And so you can actually disseminate actual sounds at this time, right? But it's not just the recording technology, it's also the notational technology, right? The International Phonetic Alphabet is sort of is in vogue at this time among linguists. And so you can notate visually the very diverse sounds of different languages, right? And people are very enthusiastic about this. But linguistics itself is new, right? It's a new paradigm, right? The founder of sort of structural linguistics is Ferdinand de Saussure, right? Whom sometimes we read in theory classes in sociology, strangely enough. But if you read Bourdieu, he really criticizes Saussure really vehemently. He's like, Saussure doesn't take into account the social behind the sound. So it's a whole technology of thinking, right? How do you measure language, right? One of the things that Y.R. Chow does is he records language and then he graphs it, right? But why do you, like, language is something accessible to the ears directly, right? Just like writing is accessible to the eyes. You don't need an intervening medium to chart it, right? But he has people speak into machines and then it graphs like the pitches of their noises. He invents musical notation to record tones in Chinese. They're still called Chow. Chow notation, in tone notation in IPA, in the International Phonetic Alphabet, and so it's a confluence of technologies at this time, a confluence of scientific ideologies that makes this sort of new creation possible, right? You need注音符号 and Hanyu pinyin are sort of stem from the same stock because they're meant to represent sounds in a much more scientific way, right? How do you represent sounds pre-modern, right? Sounds are very important. How do you get rhyming poetry in Chinese, right? This is how they used to do it. They would group characters into rhyming classes. They didn't actually rhyme in practice because many different dialects have very different rhymes, right? But they're in the abstract, like it's like a Song dynasty, like sort of imagined ideal. These characters all rhyme, right? There's actually an example from the ROC national anthem. 三民主义五党所宗，建民国以敬大同。And then one of them is feng, right? But feng in modern Chinese doesn't rhyme with the other ones. It's actually feng. It's F-E-N-G. It's not O-N-G. Because in Beijing dialect it doesn't rhyme. That you cannot anything ending in b, anything beginning in b, p, m, f cannot end in ong in Chinese. So in Mandarin, sorry. But it rhymes in the classical rhyme books, right? So that's why Sun Yat-sen put that there, because it actually does rhyme in sort of in the rhyming dictionaries. And so that's one way things were classified back then, but like, alphabetical representations are a new technology. Translation, Lydia Liu is famous for writing about this. I didn't know that oxygen was called 酸素 in Japanese, but that's a German translation. Yeah, the word for oxygen in German is Sauerstoff, sour stuff. It creates acids, right? So yeah, oxygen, the genesis of acids, and so a lot of these are translations, and 风险. There's actually a book called Hygienic Modernity. So if anyone's in Chinese history, that's a great Ruth Rogaski. And so it's a keyword search book, right? Here's a word in Chinese, it's 卫生, right? Hygiene. But there's a classical precedent to it, right? So a lot of the translations in Chinese are sort of pulling old phrases and forcing them to align with new meanings. So 卫生 means to protect life, right? But if you just sort of align it with the sort of Western idea of hygiene, right? It's actually a Japanese phrase too, eisei. Then it means something new, right? So there's a lot of terminological shifts. So it's not just about translating words, it's also about moving categories of meaning so that things align in a cluster, right? Now suddenly 卫生 just means hygiene, right? And so, so you get a lot of sort of modern literature that's like translationese, right? It's the grammar is influenced by European models and the sort of semantic boxes that the Chinese and other languages are forced into are also sort of Western models in many cases. Yeah. Okay.
就 就是一点点，就是刚刚那个问题，我应该是我没有问完了，就是他们是 elites， 那他们怎么 fit 在你的 model？ 就这个 top down， 这些 elites 也是 part of 你的 top down model 吗
？So they're really just working in the state. So you know the elites are really. It's not a bottom-up model. It's not a sort of consumption sort of model. It's we need to create the market in order for this periodical press to actually be viable. Because you know the circulation of these sort of very early newspapers is really low. It's not this only lasted 3 years, right? For 3 or 4 years. And so you know we think about magazines. We think they come every month, but you know they die sometimes, right? There's no market for them. And so it can be difficult to disseminate something if there's no consumer class. So the consumer class has to be created. You have to make people literate, make people think that this is important. And so I think that's part of what I'm trying to sort of communicate.
好，很谢谢那个 Jeff 的演讲哈，我想他的演讲可以呈现说亚比中心希望亚洲比较的这个重要性，然后但是这个重要性又需要很多的基础，今天大家可能都被这些多语。先崇拜，然后再想这到底是怎么一回事，所以我们很难得在台湾有社会学界，然后呢从语言来研究这个东亚的变迁，是一个非常珍贵的研究。那也希望大家继续跟 Jeff 交流，也期待他的书可以早日出版。那我们掌声再谢谢 Jeff。好，那我们的今天演讲就到这里为止，谢谢大家的参加。那 Jeff 可能还有10分钟的时间，是不是？大家可以再跟他交流一下。好，谢谢。